Okay, welcome everybody, and today our ethics course is going to talk a little bit about Chapter 1 out of your text. This is from the Michael J. Quinn Ethics for the Information Age. And Chapter 1 is entitled Catalyst4Change, and it talks a lot about milestones in the way of computing and the computing cycle, networking and a cycle of networking, and storage and a cycle of storage. So, Diane, you want to talk a little bit about the computing cycle?
Well, as you go through the book, one of the first things they talk about is just the process of adding things together. And they start with the abacus and then move to different mechanized ways of doing that. Well, one of the things I found very interesting is that when they were talking about punched cards with the Hollerith card, they used those with the 1890 census, and it took 8 years to process the data from the 1880 census, but only 2 years once they had introduced the punch cards. So I thought that was an interesting step in history, and certainly, decreasing it by that much is just pretty significant.
Quite a gain there. One of the things that I always find interesting when you start talking about computing is how things do cycle. And one of the observations I have is that at one point we were involved with mainframe systems, and we had little terminals, and then this whole evolution took place about 25 years ago, the evolution of a personal computer, and moving the power of the processor and the storage and memory and all that onto a person's desktop and away from a centralized unit. Well, here we are sitting a lot of years later, and we're moving back to that paradigm. And what I'm talking about is cloud computing. Right now, one of the really hot topics in computing is the cloud. We're moving everything over to the cloud. And what that really means is that we're back to centralized computing resources, and we're all accessing it really using dummy terminals. And so we can virtualize, and this is an enormous topic right now in IT, is the virtualization of, and we start with servers and consolidation. So in other words, with virtualization we can run, instead of having 10 different physical boxes out there all with servers on them, we can consolidate those and run all those on one big box. And you think, what might be the return on that? Well, one, this power issue that we have going on in energy. Instead of having 10 500-watt power supplies, we have one through that consolidation. So there's kind of a green trend to it. Two, it's much easier to deploy those in a virtual environment, so our administrative costs go way down on this too. And then three, we can back things up easier. We have greater ability for redundancy. And one of the places where I see this has taken place is at the University of Montana here. A year ago, we virtualized our email. So our email is being hosted by a third party, and it sits somewhere out in the cloud. And I guess the benefit to students is that it's more reliable because it's maintained somewhere by somebody there 24/7. And then secondly, they have access to cloud applications. Like every student right now has in the cloud Microsoft applications, Word, Excel, PowerPoint. It's all part of their cloud computing environment that goes with their email package. So the next kind of cycle is discussed in the text here is networking, the networking cycle. So I'll let you launch on that one.
Launch on that one. Well, when you talk about networking, you're talking about connectivity and communication. And one of the things that the book talks about is the fact that the telephone, the introduction of the telephone, was really the first online communications medium. And it's interesting to consider what the impact of the telephone was. That was a big social change, and people had all sorts of concerns about it. One of their concerns was people of their social class that were not of their social class would now be able to communicate with them. And you couldn't be quite as selective about who you talked with. I guess you had the choice not to answer your phone, but still there was an ease of access that hadn't been there before. I think another important aspect ties back to the discussion of the Amish and technology at the beginning of the chapter. One of the things that the Amish do is evaluate how technology is going to affect their community. And the example in the text showed that a barbecue gas grill is good for the community because it promotes social interaction, but a telephone does not because it prevents face-to-face communication. And I think that that is another important consideration. When you look at networking today, we are so interconnected as far as computers and data, but we are also far removed from interpersonal communications than we've ever been. You know, you watch my kids today, they text, they don't speak on the phone. And they really don't have conversations face-to-face either. So it is kind of a big cycle where we didn't have very much connectivity. Now we've got computers that are all interconnected, but our personal communication, I think, has really dropped.
I think from an ethics standpoint, you always think of social conventions. Like, for instance, you know, maybe there was a concern that we'd have people who would just call us out of the blue. You know, the example of telephone. Hey, somebody's calling me, and that might be disturbing. They're interrupting our privacy. They're actually in our home. And they're on their voices on the phone there. And we can make similar cases today about the internet. We have our internet on our phone, and in some cases it's invasive of our personal privacy. Another ethical thought dealing with this is social conventions. So, for instance, anytime we have a new technology like the telephone, there's a whole social convention as to how do we answer that phone, and depend upon how that's utilized. I might give a couple examples. My cell phone, I might say, "Yo, what's going on?" Versus if I'm answering the phone for a business, I'm going to introduce myself. Hello, this is Tom, and you've called such and such a business here. So there's different conventions on how we communicate with one another, and I think a lot of these happen at a very young age. I know when I was quite young, I was taught, you know, there's a right way and a wrong way to answer the telephone, and we need to have, good manners, be polite. You know, we still teach that at our house. But when we kind of morph this into, say, email, what does that mean? You know, how are we polite in our email? And of course, we know the conventions with that communication. Somebody sends me an email that's all in caps. Really, it's the equivalent of they're yelling at me. You know, they're raising their voice. So I think that's all, you know, very interesting, and it brings these ethical discussions and dilemmas.
You know, I think another aspect to consider is that whenever you introduce a technology, it's pretty easy to figure out what some of the good uses are. And as soon as you determine what a good use is, someone else can think of a bad use. You know, you can do the same thing with telephone calls. You can have harassing phone calls, and people can use technology for good or for bad.
So our last, as we kind of wrap this up here, our last area that we look at, you know, we talked about the computing cycle, the networking cycle, and the last area I want to discuss today is the storage technologies and the storage cycle. And my favorite story from the Quintext here is the discussion about the Irish, I believe about the 2nd century, the Irish monks, how they came up with this technology where they were actually carving the equivalent of letters using big wooden boards, and then they were putting ink on it, and they were stamping these big sheepskins to preserve written history. What a great idea! So, you know, being of Irish descent, I'm very proud of that. I think that's awesome how the Irish are the saviors of the written word. I'm sure historically others might disagree with that. But again, that's a use of technology that preceded the printing press, which is historically Gutenberg came out in the printing press in the Middle Ages, and that just that made education universal, where we had access, and that's, you know, we have access to the printed word there. So, and then Diane, you were talking a little bit about some of these, you know, either magnetic, optic, and solid state storage technologies, but this thing called RFID, and you're placing these devices in animals right now. Is that correct?
That's right. You know, veterinarians have been touting this for several years. You can get a small chip that has contact information, and that can be embedded in your pet's skin, just underneath their skin. And so if your pet gets lost, one of the first things that any shelter does now is scan to see if there's a microchip. And that can, you know, reunite lost pets, and it can do all sorts of great things. We can expand that technology and look at human use for that. There's been talk of people having all of their medical records on an implanted chip. And you know, another use of the technology is using that just to keep track of people. Alzheimer's patients sometimes get lost, get confused, and a lot of times the only way that you can really keep track of them is to have an aide with them at all times, or someone. Some people have floated the idea of using RFID chips in patients with diminished mental capacity to allow them a little bit more freedom. And you know, there are all sorts of ethical questions that come up with that.
So that's all. That's really, I think, as you just reading through this is a rich chapter. There's lots of great historic significance here, and we're just starting to kind of craft some issues brought about through technology of the ethical nature.
Thanks.